Situated on a gently sloping south-facing hill is a sanctuary, a place of rest, a haven for wildlife, a fascinating place to explore, with glorious trees, flowering shrubs and wildflowers. Almost a garden. This place came into being because of a simple problem. Too many dead people and nowhere to put them. The population of Britain more than doubled between 1831 and 1901, from 13.9 to 32.5 million. Birth rates rose steadily, people were marrying younger, and families were multiplying and growing. By the 1840s, the dramatic explosion of industry and commerce, which began with the Industrial Revolution, offered unprecedented opportunities for many. But general policies to improve public health were slow in coming. Principal among these were clean water and sanitation. Many died of diseases that today can be treated or avoided. Average life expectancy was only around 40 years, often less in cities. The rising tide of humanity had its counterpoint in the body count. This was the other side of the vitality of the Victorian age. Christian belief in the physical resurrection of the dead had made cremation unacceptable for hundreds of years. In the Roman Catholic Church, the practice was forbidden until 1963. The poor, desperate to avoid the indignity of a pauper's burial, could afford only the cheapest and often most unsavoury methods of disposal. By the 1840s, Gothic horror may no longer have been a respected literary term, but reports of the existing practice in burial grounds left little for the penny dreadful to embellish. Despite the routine disinterment of old bones which could be removed and stored to make space, the rising ground of a small parish churchyard could easily contain the remains of 20,000 bodies. Each plot might have been used 200 times. The towns were overcrowded. There was no space left for the dead. Nonconformists, barred from burial within Church of England plots, had made their own provision, close to their chapels and places of worship, and often in the centre of towns, as they did here in Mill Street, Bedford. The situation was exploited in some of the worst examples of grisly private enterprise. Sparfields in Clerkenwell, London, a burial plot of barely more than 2 acres, opened in 1778. By the 1840s it was being run as a gruesome speculative business, whose cheap rates attracted custom from the poor of all the surrounding parishes. Though it was common practice to remove old bones disinterred as a result of fresh digging, here the fresh bodies were being disturbed and removed to make space. Coffins were being burnt, as was other material, in contempt of the prevailing beliefs. The Times of March 5, 1845, quoted Reuben Room, a former gravedigger.
"I've severed head, arms, legs, or whatever came in my way, with a crowbar, pickaxe, chopper and saw. I've often put a rope round the neck of the corpse to drag it out of the coffin."
It was no job for the squeamish. The rural market town of Bedford was home to just 7,000 souls in 1831, but by the turn of the century its population had grown to 35,000. Its principal industries were brewing and the manufacture of agricultural implements. Outbreaks of cholera occurred in 1832 and 1849. Sewers weren't constructed until 1864. Though not heavily industrialised and without anything like the scale of the problems which affected the big cities, it was no exception to the unsanitary norm for early Victorian towns.
We are brought to the state of the town of Bedford, which seems to have an extraordinary taste for the gases of decomposition, having a dozen burial grounds for little more than 9,000 people, and in one street of about 220 paces, 4 distinct graveyards occupy its southern and hottest side in the most prejudicial situations. At one end of the street there is a horrible stinking candle fat melting factory, faced on the opposite side of the street by a butcher's slaughterhouse and dung heap, with a stable under the same roof. Further along the south side of the street is a burial ground, walled up with the Baptist's chapel, 20 paces west of the chandlery. Then 20 yards beyond that is the graveyard of Howard Chapel. Then beyond that is a pigsty at the George and Dragon. Then further on is a hide and leather dressing workshop adjoining the densely filled graveyard of Bunyan's Chapel, which is only separated by one premises and a narrow road from the grave ground of St Cuthbert's parish. The street, where all these sources of pestilence fructify, enjoys the name of Mill Street, but might, now that the mills are no more, be known as Stench Street.
Bedford was fortunate in one respect, however, in that at least one influential local resident had been prompted to improve things. James White was born in 1816 in Hemel Hempstead. A journalist, he came to Bedford in 1845, where he started up his own newspaper, the Bedford Times. In 1846 he began a campaign to found a new municipal cemetery, prompted by concerns over the stench emanating from the overcrowded burial grounds in and around the town centre, which were compounded by the dreadful odours produced by the various business premises nearby. It is easy to see how James White became convinced of the need for an out-of-town burial site, and how he managed to persuade others. In addition to being the local newspaper proprietor, he was also borough treasurer, an unpaid post at the time, but which must have contributed to the success of his campaign. He purchased the original 18 acres of land on behalf of the borough council, and the cemetery was officially opened in June 1855. In later years, the original area was expanded to cover 37 acres. James died in 1878, and his grave is a fitting tribute to the man who was the founder of the beautiful amenity we enjoy today, and who not only did so much to improve the lot of the living inhabitants of Victorian Bedford, but also provided their dear departed with a more peaceful and wholesome last resting place. There are now some 100,000 graves recorded here, and the huge variety of 50,000 memorials and gravestones offers a wealth of historical and genealogical interest. The red brick gatehouse and the stone chapel buildings were designed by Thomas Jobson Jackson, a Bedford architect, who was also responsible, with the assistance of John Usher, for the layout of the cemetery. Thomas Dan, who was the first superintendent registrar for the cemetery, lived here, along with his wife and 9 children. They didn't even occupy the whole building, but squeezed into the right-hand side of it and the room above the archway. To the left of the arch, the building contained the mortuary and the registrar's office. One can only imagine what life was like for a family of 11 in such cramped conditions. The chapel was originally designed as 2 separate chapels, one Church of England and another for dissenters. Converted to incorporate a crematorium in the 1950s, it closed in 1995 when the new North Road crematorium opened. Foster Hill Road was adopted as the name of our cemetery to avoid confusion. With no more room for burials apart from the small number of unused spaces within family plots, this old cemetery has now become part of Bedford's heritage of historical monuments and quiet recreational areas. It is looked after by a charity, the Friends of Bedford Cemetery.
I'm Ruth Hogan, and I'm a Sunday Times best-selling author, and my books have sold over 1 million copies worldwide. But I'm also a lover of cemeteries, and this one in particular. And I'm lucky enough to be the president of the Friends of Bedford Cemetery. Because cemeteries aren't just places for the dead. They're full of life and beauty, wildlife, birds and trees. And part of the grounds here are a designated county wildlife site containing many rare species of plants, including lichens and orchids. All year round, birds, butterflies and other creatures make use of this undisturbed setting. The Friends of Bedford Cemetery are a small local charity set up to conserve and enhance this unique heritage site in the heart of Bedford. Volunteers have cleaned and mended stonework, weeded and tidied graves, and cared for some of the plants and shrubs. This is an ongoing project, and each Thursday informal groups meet to continue with this rewarding work. New volunteers are always warmly welcome to help with this and the numerous other tasks carried out by the Friends of Bedford Cemetery. As a result of research undertaken by members of the charity into the lives of the people buried here and the involvement of experts in various fields, many fascinating talks have been presented here. Heritage Open Days are held and guided walks are offered on themes such as crime and punishment, military graves and pioneering women. There is potential for many more. Numerous events have already taken place in the chapel. If you're involved in any educational, community or social activities, we'd love you to consider the unique spaces the cemetery has to offer as a venue for your events. This would help us to raise funds to improve and promote this wonderful cemetery as a site of enormous historical, educational and cultural interest, and to secure its future for both local residents and visitors to Bedford to continue to enjoy.